The end to Liz Truss's disastrous and epically short-lived premiership has led to some of her original backers rewriting history. This was the Daily Mail's front page following Truss's resignation. A verdict from Sarah Vine is plastered across the front page. She says, quote, "Truss was a disastrous dalliance who served only to remind us what a real leader looks like." What the Daily Mail don't tell you on that front page is that they were the number one promoters of this disastrous dalliance. I'll ask you now to cast your minds back to the last Tory leadership election earlier this summer. MPs were deciding which two candidates would face the party members. It was clear to everyone the final two candidates would be Rishi Sunak and Eva Penny-Mordaunt or Liz Truss. And during that period, the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday stepped up to offer 10 front pages to make sure Liz Truss got in that final two. Of course, instead of Penny-Mordaunt, they included July the 10th, Truss, I'll spike Sunak's tax hike. July the 12th, Truss, back me or it'll be Rishi. July the 14th, unite now or we lose. Truss tells Tory right. The next day, July the 15th, Mordaunt under the microscope. And you've got July the 16th, Liz tax boost for families. July the 19th, Mordaunt's number 10 bid hits buffers. So that was the Mail doing everything in their power to get Liz Truss elected as Prime Minister. And this was how they responded to her becoming Prime Minister. Cometh the hour, cometh the woman. And then the response to the mini-budget, at last, a true Tory budget. So you have a newspaper which probably did more than anyone to get this woman in office. Of course, the Daily Mail readership might be lower than it once was, but it's still pretty influential along the Tory benches. So in that crucial few days when, if you remember, Liz Truss overtook Penny Mordaunt to get into that final two, I think the Daily Mail's front pages, day after day after day after day, could have been pretty consequential. Now they have the cheek when she resigns to say, oh God, yeah, this was always a disaster, wasn't it? You backed it more than anyone. Moving on from the media, Mark Littlewood is the director of the right-wing think tank Institute of Economic Affairs. After the mini-budget, he tweeted this. He's quote tweeting a tweet from Tim Montgomery we've shown you before. And Tim Montgomery tweeted, "A massive moment for the Institute of Economic Affairs. They've been advocating these policies for years. They incubated Truss and Kwarteng during their early years as MPs. Britain is now their laboratory." Tim Montgomery isn't of the IEA, but Mark Littlewood is the director. And he quote tweets this with the sunglasses emoji. So he's clearly endorsing what Tim Montgomery says and is proud of what Tim Montgomery says. Now, this is Mark Littlewood speaking 2 weeks later to Politico. So he says, "I'm pretty distraught about it. It did actually appear as if we had a new government that in very broad terms shared the IEA analysis, the problems with our economy, and it not being market-oriented enough. The position we're in now is that these reforms basically have not been tried. Her attempts to implement change were too hurried, too rushed, not thought through, naive in some regards." You've got Mark Littlewood there. Obviously, what caused the collapse of Liz Truss was that mini-budget. When that mini-budget was released, he's like, brilliant, yeah, this is the IEA's laboratory, we love this. It all collapses like, oh, actually, no, that wasn't really what we believed. And it was executed really badly. Well, the execution was the mini-budget you endorsed. Aaron, lots of people with egg on their faces, the Daily Mail, other segments of the right-wing press. I mean, the Telegraph backed Truss. And then you've got all these think tanks who are saying, oh, no, this wasn't actually libertarianism. Our crazy ideology still hasn't been properly tried. How damaging will this be for them?
They've nuked their credibility for quite a long time, Michael. And I'm sure it won't stop the BBC and Sky, inviting them on to bloody everything. But it's a major, major problem for them. What's interesting, Michael, is if you actually look at Thatcher, when she comes in 79-80, the first couple of budgets are actually quite strategic. So she reduces the top rate of tax, but she increases VAT in 79. Well, her chancellor increases VAT in 79, Geoffrey Howe, I think. And then you get, believe this or not, Michael, windfall taxes, I think in 1980 on the banks and on North Sea oil. So she's increasing VAT, very regressive, but it's a tax rise. And she's increasing, and she's introduced a windfall tax. And I think what the IEA, Farage, all the right-wing papers, they all look at like the late 80s. So they all look at the Lawson budgets. I hope I'm getting that right. Particularly 1988, where you have what is, equivalent to, in today's terms, like a £35 billion tax cut. 86, 87, huge tax cuts, right? Not as big as was being proposed in the mini budget, bizarrely, but they were still big. And over several years, you're looking at, astronomical tax cuts. How did that happen? Two things. North Sea oil, and you have massive growth. In 1988, Britain was seeing something like 5.7% economic growth. partly because of oil, partly because you were privatizing everything, but that's just how things were working at that time. So you had high growth. And I think the IEA and the CPS was, of course, set up, I think, in the late 70s with Keith Joseph. So these are all these are think tanks, which actually the IEA even existed before Thatcher. Their project was to create somebody like Thatcher. That's how long they've been around. They all looked at Thatcher in the late 80s and were like, let's do that all over again. Let's have the tax cuts that you see in the late 1980s. Only problem is, guys, there isn't the economic growth, okay? There's not the tax receipts coming from the growth that can pay for tax cuts. So they looked at the wrong Thatcher. They should have been looking at Thatcher in 79, 80, 81, be a bit more strategic. But the Thatcher cosplay people got it upside down, Michael. They looked at the 1980s. And I think the reason why they did that is because they're not involved in real politics. They have nothing on the line here, Michael. If they're wrong, what happens to them? Right? They still get funded by their undisclosed financial backers who nobody ever names. They still go on LBC. They still go on the BBC. They still go to the Spectator Summer Garden Party. What's the downside for them? Even after this, this is, Michael, by the way, the mini budget was the single biggest avoidable political misstep in domestic British political history ever. Even after that, these people are still going to be able to enjoy their G&Ts with Andrew Neil at the Spectator Party next June. So that's why they keep on doing this, is because they keep on getting away with it. I think this time, they're going to be mocked and derided for a good few years yet. But this is the thing, Michael. They will be there in 10 years' time. They will be there in 15 years' time. The IEA, I believe, goes back to the 60s. These are very old organizations. And the new right always plays the long game. So yes, they're a joke today. There'll be a joke in 6 months. Hopefully there'll be a joke in 6 years. But these people don't seem to go anywhere. They're kind of like cockroaches in a nuclear war. That's how I see Mark Littlewood right now. He will survive, the IEA will survive, and their toxic politics will carry on. That's why the left needs to formulate a popular alternative, because it won't magically happen by itself.